Hello everyone. Please tell me, which city are you listening from? What time is it there? I remember that night as if it were etched into my bones, the way the cold seeped through my jacket and the snow crunched beneath my boots. I had been walking along the narrow forest road, the sky low and gray, the world muffled under a blanket of freshly fallen snow. There was a stillness to the air, a quiet that felt both peaceful and wrong at the same time. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start hearing things that shouldn't exist. My breath made little clouds that quickly dissolved into the air, and I kept telling myself I should turn back, that the cold and the growing darkness were enough reason to head home. But then I saw them. Footprints, fresh deep imprints in the snow, winding between the trees and curving along the road, moving with a purpose that made my chest tighten. At first, I thought someone had been walking the same path earlier, maybe a lost hiker or a neighbor, but something about the way the prints twisted unnaturally through the forest caught my attention. They didn't follow the road in a predictable pattern. Instead, they dipped between trees, vanished briefly behind a small mound of snow, and reappeared as though the snow itself had accepted them. I felt compelled to follow, my curiosity mingled with an inexplicable unease, the sort of cold dread that runs down your spine and lodges there. My boots left my own prints beside them, a rhythm of steps in the empty, frosty night, each one echoing too loudly in the muffled world. The further I went, the darker the forest became, even though it was only late afternoon. The snow muted the sounds, but I could hear faint, indistinct noises, a scraping against a branch, the faint crack of ice beneath some hidden weight. I told myself it was the wind, the snow settling, but my pulse thrummed louder with each step, and a shiver traveled down my back. The footprints led me through a narrow clearing, where the trees arched overhead like a cathedral, shadows stretching long and dark across the snow. I could feel the air thicken, each breath catching slightly, and I realized I was holding my own breath more often, as though the forest itself demanded silence. I thought about turning back, about retracing my steps, but the footprints seemed to pulse in the snow, beckoning, teasing. I kept walking. The wind whispered faintly between the trees, but it wasn't the wind I was hearing. It was something softer, almost like a voice just beyond comprehension, murmuring syllables I could not understand. My mind tried to rationalize, to convince me that the cold and isolation were conjuring things my imagination wanted me to see, but every instinct screamed otherwise. I walked on. Eventually, the footprints led me out of the denser woods and onto the edge of the clearing where I had parked my car hours earlier. I froze. The prints continued for a little while across the open snow, perfectly clear, before slowing, spacing out strangely until they stopped abruptly. I followed my eyes along the trail, expecting to see a figure, some indication of who or what had made them. But there was nothing, just the endless white blanket of snow. My heart beat fast, a strange icy tightness in my chest. I turned around, expecting to see the footprints continuing behind me, but there was only my own path back through the snow, fading under the relentless wind. I exhaled shakily and began walking toward my car, trying to dismiss the thought that had begun to gnaw at me. But as I got closer, I realized something impossible. The footprints hadn't ended out in the clearing. They had reappeared, impossibly, and now led directly to my front door. Not across the yard, not along the road, but stopping exactly at my doorstep. I hadn't noticed anyone coming up while I was inside my car, yet there they were, imprints that belonged to someone or something, ending at the threshold. I didn't touch the door. I didn't want to know if the prints were real, if someone had actually followed me home, because a part of me feared the answer. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, watching the snow settle, covering parts of the trail, but never the ones at my door. They remained stubborn, unmoving, a reminder that someone or something had arrived before I did. The wind moaned through the trees, carrying with it that faint whispering I had first heard in the forest. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the cold and the fear had made the night speak to me. When I finally forced myself to open the door and step inside, the house was quiet, the familiar warmth wrapping around me like a protective blanket. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the snow outside was not empty, that something was watching from just beyond the glass. That night, I barely slept. I could feel the weight of the footprints at my door pressing in, the cold radiating from the steps outside, as if the snow itself remembered every shape that had passed over it. I checked the windows, I locked the doors, yet in the back of my mind, I could not dismiss the feeling that those footprints had never really left, and that they might still be waiting. Days later, after the snow had melted into slush and mud, I went outside to check the yard. The footprints were gone, erased by the thawing weather. But when I pressed my hand to the cold metal of the doorstep, I could swear I felt a depression in the wood, the faint outline of a foot, as if someone had been standing there, just outside, watching me. I told myself it was impossible, a trick of memory and imagination. And yet, on some nights, when the wind howls and the world feels too quiet, I swear I can hear the soft crunch of snow against the earth, the echo of footsteps that led right up to my door, stopping just short of the warmth inside and waiting. I was always drawn to the quiet, to the places untouched by the noise of the world. So when I found the cabin, a small secluded structure hidden deep within the woods, it felt like a sign, a place to escape, to find some peace away from the demands of everyday life. The listing described it as an off-grid retreat, a rustic haven for those seeking solitude. And after a long few months of work, it was exactly what I needed. The drive there had been long and difficult, the narrow road winding through thick trees that seemed to close in around me the further I went. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I craved it. But when I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the calm kind, but the heavy, almost suffocating quiet that settled over the cabin, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stepped out of my car, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound breaking the stillness. The cabin stood in front of me, small but sturdy, its weathered wooden walls blending with the landscape. The windows were dark, and the door was slightly ajar, as though someone had just recently left, but there was no sign of life, no trail of footsteps in the dirt, no car parked nearby, just the stillness of the woods and the soft, constant rustling of the wind in the trees. I pushed the door open, the creaking sound filling the silence. Inside, the air was cool but not cold. The place was exactly as I had imagined, simple yet charming. A small wooden table in the center, a stone fireplace on one wall, and a few old chairs scattered around. Everything was dusted, untouched, as if the cabin had been waiting for someone. I set my bag down by the door, the smell of pine and wood burning faint in the air. It wasn't until I turned to the fireplace that I noticed it, a lantern, glowing faintly, sitting on the stone hearth. I paused. The lantern was small, the kind you might carry on a hike, and it was burning. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls. I didn't remember seeing it in the pictures, nor did I recall anyone mentioning a lantern in the listing. It was strange. The place had been vacant for years, according to the description. No one had been here in ages. I walked over to the fireplace, my curiosity outweighing any hesitation. I reached for the lantern, expecting it to be cold, but my fingers brushed against warm glass. The flame inside was steady, a soft yellow glow that was almost comforting, but something about it felt wrong. It was too alive, too present. The rest of the cabin felt frozen in time, as though everything had been waiting for me to show up. But the lantern was a different story. It was burning, and there was no reason for it to be. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the strange feeling creeping up my spine. It was an old cabin, after all, and maybe there was a simple explanation. Perhaps the lantern had been left behind by someone who stayed here recently, or maybe there was some sort of mechanism I didn't understand. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that it wasn't just a lantern. It was something else, something aware. I decided to settle in for the night. I closed the door and pulled the shutters on the windows, blocking out the darkening sky. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the fire, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The wind outside picked up, its soft howling against the cabin, walls becoming the only sound, and I tried to let the peacefulness of the moment take over. But the lantern, it bothered me. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me. Every time I glanced at the fireplace, the lantern seemed to draw my attention, its soft light flickering in the growing dark. There was something hypnotic about the way it burned, steady and unblinking. I couldn't remember ever seeing it burn that bright, even in the strongest winds. And the longer I stared at it, the more I felt like the room was closing in around me. Then, it happened. I stood up to put my mug down, and as I moved across the room, I swore I saw something flicker in the reflection of the glass. A shadow, something dark moving just behind the lantern. But when I turned, the room was empty. The air in the cabin was still, the fire crackling softly, and the lantern glowed steadily. My heart raced, and I turned back to the fire. Nothing, just the light of the lantern. I went back to my seat, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the isolation of the cabin, the way the darkness outside felt so heavy, so thick against the walls. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't relax. The lantern kept drawing my gaze, and the shadows around it grew deeper, darker, as though something else was lurking just out of reach. The wind outside began to howl louder, shaking the windows in their frames. I stood up again, determined to close the shutters properly, to make the cabin feel more secure. But as I reached for the window latch, I heard a noise behind me. It was faint, so faint I almost thought I had imagined it. A soft rustling, like the movement of fabric, the kind of noise someone makes when they're standing too close. I spun around, but no one was there. The lantern, however, was still burning, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. I took a step toward it, my mind racing. The wind outside grew wilder, rattling the cabin in its fury, but the flame inside the lantern remained steady, calm. The shadows around it seemed to dance, as though they were moving of their own accord. I reached for it, my hand trembling slightly. It was warm to the touch, just as it had been earlier. But the flame inside the glass flickered suddenly, casting an odd, twisting shadow across the walls. And then I heard it, a voice, soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It was coming. From the lantern, from the flame itself. "Stay with me," it said. I jerked back, my heart pounding in my chest. The words weren't loud, but they were clear, as if someone had whispered them right into my ear. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the scent of smoke and pine. The lantern's flame swayed slightly, and I knew, with an instinctive certainty, that it had never been mine. It had always been here, waiting, watching. I looked around the cabin, my breathing shallow. The shadows were no longer still. They moved, creeping toward me, as if the walls themselves had come alive. The room seemed to shrink, pressing in on me. The wind howled outside, but inside, it felt as if the very cabin had fallen silent, its breath held, waiting for something to happen. And that was when I noticed it, in the reflection of the lantern, just behind my shoulder. A figure, tall, with long, dark hair that cascaded down like smoke. It was there, watching me, a presence that wasn't mine. The eyes were dark, hollow, and the figure didn't move, didn't speak. But the lantern, the flame, seemed to pulse, as if it were trying to reach out, to pull me into its glow. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The whispering came again, soft and insistent. "Stay." The warmth of the lantern surrounded me, suffocating, pulling at my very soul. And I knew, without a doubt, that I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I had to escape. But the door was locked. The windows sealed tight. The flame flickered once more, casting an even darker shadow across the room. And in that instant, I understood. The lantern was never meant to light the room. It had been waiting for me. It was the kind of evening that felt like it belonged to another time, the air thick with the scent of earth and pine, and the forest surrounding me so still it was as if it were holding its breath. I had been hiking all day, losing myself in the familiar solace of nature, the kind of quiet that presses against you, wrapping you in its solitude. I had taken this trail before many times, in fact, but something about it felt different this evening. The sun was dipping low in the sky, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, but the forest floor was already cast in shadows. The deeper I went into the woods, the less I noticed the passage of time. My steps were light, barely making a sound on the soft earth as I wandered farther off the trail, lured by the strange pull of the trees. They stood tall around me, their bark rough and dark, their branches twisting into impossible shapes like ancient hands reaching for the sky. But the deeper I ventured, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds, insects, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush had faded. The forest, which was usually alive with sound, had become unnervingly silent. At first, I thought it was just the wind. It often had that way of settling over the trees, making everything seem still. But as I walked further, I began to notice that even the wind was gone. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on me, and it felt like the entire forest had gone still, waiting. My heartbeat quickened, but I brushed the feeling aside. It's just the isolation, I thought. Asterisk, just the wilderness playing tricks. Then, the silence was broken. A whisper. It was faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it grew louder with each step I took. The voice was soft, unintelligible at first, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere ahead of me, deep within the trees. It felt like it was right. There, just beyond the reach of my senses, like something was watching me from the shadows. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper didn't sound like the wind, or the shifting of branches. It was more deliberate, more human. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods around me, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but all I saw were trees and shadows. The path was barely visible now, swallowed by the thickening darkness as the sun sank lower, and then, just as I thought I must have imagined it, the whisper came again, clearer this time. Asterisk, come closer. It was a voice that seemed familiar, yet distant. I couldn't place it, but there was something about it that tugged at the back of my mind, something that made my skin crawl. I took a hesitant step forward, the leaves crunching underfoot, and the air grew colder, heavier. A strange sensation crawled up my spine, like I was being drawn toward something I didn't fully understand. But the pull was undeniable, and despite the unease growing in my chest, I took another step. And then, from the very depths of the trees, it came again. This time, louder, clearer. The whisper was no longer a mere murmur, it was a calling. Asterisk, come closer. It's waiting. My heart thudded against my ribs, and the hairs on my neck stood on end. It wasn't my name, but it sounded so familiar, like it was meant just for me. My mind raced, questioning everything. Asterisk, was I hearing things? Asterisk, could it be someone else in the woods, lost or calling for help? I strained my ears, trying to hear anything that would explain the voice, but all I could hear was the thick silence that followed. I took another step forward, compelled, unable to resist. The trees loomed higher now, their trunks gnarled and twisted, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. I was losing track of time, the path behind me now completely obscured by the darkness of the forest. The air felt colder still, and with each step, it seemed to press in closer, suffocating. My legs felt heavier, like the forest itself was weighing me down, urging me deeper into its embrace. Then, through the thickening shadows, I saw it. A clearing, barely visible through the trees, where the moonlight broke through the canopy just enough to reveal a large, flat stone at the center. Stood out against the rest of the forest like an altar, a place that seemed too deliberate to be natural. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, my feet moving before my mind could catch up. The whispering stopped. A sudden unnatural stillness fell over the clearing. The only sound now was my own breath, shallow and quick. I could feel something watching me, not from a distance, but so close it felt like the very air around me was alive, aware of my every movement. And then, through the silence, I heard it, my name. Asterisk Lena. Asterisk, the voice came from behind me, but I didn't turn. I couldn't. My body was frozen, rooted to the spot, as though I had crossed some invisible line, and now the forest itself held me captive. The moonlight fell across the stone in the clearing, and I realized it wasn't just a rock, it was something more. Symbols, old and worn by time, were etched into its surface, their shapes familiar yet unknowable. The cold radiating from it was unlike anything I had ever felt, a deep, ancient cold that felt as though it had been there longer than the earth itself. The voice came again, clearer this time, more urgent, as though it were inside my mind now. Lena. You have come. You have finally come. My heart pounded in my chest, panic rising within me. I tried to move, tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place, as though something was holding me there, unwilling to let me go. The shadows around me shifted. There were figures now, appearing from the edges of the clearing, emerging from the darkness like they had been there all along, waiting. They were not human, at least, not in the way I understood. Their shapes were distorted, their limbs elongated, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. And yet, I knew them, as if I had seen them before, or perhaps always known them. And then, the voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't alone. It was joined by others, whispering in unison. You are not alone. A sense of realization washed over me, cold and final. I wasn't supposed to be here. This forest, this place, was not meant for anyone to walk through. And the figures, the voices, they weren't calling me to welcome me. They were calling me to stay forever. With every ounce of strength I had, I turned and I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the forest, or if I even did. The path I had walked earlier was gone, swallowed by the woods, and I stumbled through the underbrush, blind with fear, my breath ragged in my chest. The whispers never stopped. They followed me, echoed in my mind, pressing in on me, louder, clearer with every step. When I finally emerged from the trees, I found myself back at the edge of the town, my heart still racing, my hands trembling. The air was warm again, the hum of life returning to the world around me. The whispers faded with each step away from the forest, until they were nothing more than a distant memory. But sometimes, when I walk through the woods now, when the night is still and the air thick with silence, I hear it again, my name whispered on the wind, carried through the trees, and I know that I am still being watched, and that the forest is still waiting. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a quiet getaway. I'd been craving solitude for weeks, away from the noise, the rush, the endless demands of everyday life. So when I found this old secluded cabin at the edge of a dense forest, I jumped. At the opportunity, the brochure had promised it would be perfect for recharging. And it was, at least. That's what I kept telling myself as I settled in, unpacking my things in the dimming light of the late afternoon. The cabin itself was rustic, charming even, though a little worn. The woods smelled of pine and age, the kind of earthy scent that made me feel grounded, as though I had arrived somewhere untouched. I lit a fire in the hearth and sat on the couch, feeling the first real peace I had felt in months. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional whistle of the wind outside, shaking the trees. I opened a bottle of wine and let the silence settle around me, the room flickering in the soft, golden light. But as the night deepened, I started to feel the weight of the quiet pressing against me, like something unspoken was hanging in the air. I tried to dismiss it, brushing it off as the typical oddities of a new place, the unfamiliar creaks of the house, the rustle of leaves outside, the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far in the corners of the room. After finishing my wine, I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the heavy curtains aside. Outside, the forest was thick and black, the trees standing still against the night sky. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and only a small sliver of light filtered through, casting a pale sheen over the snow-covered ground. For a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. The cabin felt isolated, tucked far away from the rest of the world, and for the first time in ages, I allowed myself to feel completely alone. But then I saw it. At first I thought I was imagining it, a figure standing in the dark, just outside the window. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, convinced the wine or the exhaustion from the drive was playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. A person, standing just beyond the reach of the cabin, their back facing me, unmoving. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out there? I hadn't seen anyone on the road, and there were no tracks in the snow leading up to the cabin. I stood frozen, my hand still on the window pane, the glass cold against my fingers. I watched for a long time, but the figure didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It was like they were waiting for something, standing still in the dark. Too far away for me to make out any details. The silence in the cabin deepened. I should have closed the curtain, should have backed away from the window. But something kept me there, my gaze locked on the figure. And then, without warning, it happened. The figure turned. Slowly. The movement was smooth, deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it. And then, I saw it. The face, it was me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The person staring back at me from the window had my face, my eyes. The same dark hair falling around my shoulders. The same pale skin. The same look of quiet contemplation. But the look in its eyes wasn't mine. There was something off about it, something wrong. The figure's gaze was cold, unblinking, and its expression, it was not me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, my breath quickening. The figure's gaze never wavered from mine, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt the weight of its presence pressing down on me. It was as though it knew me, as if it had been waiting for me to realize what I was seeing. It was as if I had been the one waiting. I backed away from the window, my mind racing, my pulse loud in my ears. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing down as I stumbled across the floor. My legs felt weak, unsteady, and the air was suddenly too cold, too thin. I glanced at the door, but something told me not to leave. I could feel it. The figure outside, it was still there, watching me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was beginning to cloud my mind. It didn't make sense. It was just some weird trick of the light. My exhaustion, the isolation. But when I turned back to the window, the figure was still there, its face now tilted slightly, almost as if it were studying me. And then, without any movement, it smiled. That's when the panic truly set in. I couldn't breathe, my chest constricted like something was squeezing the air from me. The figure outside had my face, my exact likeness, but that smile, That smile was nothing like I'd ever worn. It was too wide, too knowing, like it knew something I didn't, something I wasn't supposed to know. I ran to the other side of the cabin, my mind spinning, heart racing. I fumbled with the lock on the door, as if by locking myself in, I could somehow escape the eyes of the thing watching me. I turned on every light in the cabin, every lamp, every candle, as if the brightness could push the figure away, could make it disappear. But as I paced back and forth in the dim-lit cabin, the whispering started. A low sound at first, like a faint hum, but growing clearer, more distinct, until I realized it was a voice that was mine, but not mine. It echoed through the rooms, soft but persistent, whispering my name over and over again. It was like the voice was coming from everywhere at once, from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, inside my own mind. "Come outside," it whispered. "It's waiting for you." I couldn't make it stop. The words swirled in my head, louder and louder, until I thought I might go mad. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voice only grew more urgent, more insistent. I looked toward the window again, terrified of what I might see, but when I approached it, I couldn't bring myself to look outside. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing that smile again, the cold, knowing smile of the figure that was me. Instead, I moved away from the window, collapsing into the corner of the room, clutching my knees to my chest. The whispering continued. But now, it was joined by something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the window, the same tapping noise I had heard earlier when I first saw the figure. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stay here. But as I stood, ready to flee, I heard one final whisper, clear and sharp in my ears. Asterisk, you're not leaving. You can't leave. And that was when the door slammed shut with a force that shook the cabin. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispering, my whispering, filled the air, the room, the cabin. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure outside. I was still waiting, and the smile, it never left. The house was old, even older than I had imagined when I first saw it. There was something about it that felt out of place, as though it didn't belong to this time, or even this world. The walls, cracked and worn, seemed to whisper memories of years long forgotten. The windows, thick with grime and age, let in just enough light to cast long shadows in the corners of the rooms. But it was the basement that drew me in. I knew there was something down there, something that had been waiting for me. I had only been in the house for a few hours when I met her. Mrs. Lockwood, the owner, a frail woman in her late 60s, with silvery hair pulled back into a tight bun. She seemed kind, but there was a strange air about her, a hesitation in her voice whenever she spoke of the house's history. She mentioned the basement only once, in passing, as I was exploring. "The house? Just don't go down there," she had said, her eyes darting away from me for a moment, before quickly returning to my face. "It's not safe." Her words lingered in the back of my mind as I walked through the rooms. The house was large, more than I could ever need, and yet I felt drawn to the basement door. It was down the hall, hidden behind a faded tapestry that hung awkwardly against the wall. The door itself was old, wooden, and its brass doorknob had worn to a dull shine. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, before I shook the thought away. Mrs. Lockwood's warning was still fresh in my mind, but I couldn't resist. Something inside me pulled me toward it, urging me to find out what lay beyond. I waited until she had gone to bed. It wasn't late, but the house had a way of making time feel irrelevant, as though the outside world didn't exist. The night settled in quickly, and I felt the weight of it around me. The darkness seemed to press against the walls, suffocating the light. I stood at the foot of the basement stairs, hand resting on the cold wooden banister, listening to the stillness of the house. The only sound was the distant ticking of a clock, its rhythmic beat steady but unnervingly loud in the silence. I could hear nothing coming from below, but the air felt different, heavier, almost thick with anticipation. With a deep breath, I twisted the doorknob and slowly pulled the door open. The stairway that led down was narrow, and the smell of mildew and something old, something forgotten, hit me immediately. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was strange, foreign. I hesitated for just a moment before descending the stairs. The wood creaked under my weight, the sound sharp in the silence. As I moved deeper into the basement, I noticed the temperature dropped. The air grew colder, a biting chill that made my skin prickle. The space below was cramped, the ceiling low, and the walls were lined with old wooden shelves filled with boxes and forgotten relics. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed. The dim light from above barely reached down, and I found myself straining to see anything clearly. I stepped further into the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust beneath my boots. And then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a tap. It echoed in the silence, coming from somewhere in the farthest corner of the basement. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat, and strained my ears. Another tap, a little louder this time. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. There was no one else here. I was alone, and yet the sound came again, louder, more insistent. Like something was knocking, trying to get my attention. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but something deeper, more primal, urged me to move closer. The knock came again, followed by a faint scratching sound. It sounded like something, or someone, was trying to get out. The light above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, making the room feel even darker, more oppressive. My hands trembled, my breathing shallow, but I couldn't stop myself. I stepped toward the source of the noise, my feet moving almost on their own. At the far end of the basement, tucked behind an old wooden chest, was a small door. It was unlike the rest of the house, newer, almost too clean in comparison to the dust and age of the surrounding room. The door was cracked open slightly, just enough for me to see the faint outline of a space beyond, though I couldn't make out any details. The knocking was louder now, frantic, coming from behind that door. I should have stopped. I should have turned around and gone back upstairs. Mrs. Lockwood had warned me, and I ignored it. But I didn't. I stepped closer to the door, the knocking now accompanied by a soft, low voice. It was muffled at first, but I could make out the words, "Help. Me, please." My stomach turned, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of the dread pressing down on me. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The door creaked on its hinges, the sound almost deafening in the silence. And then I saw it. There, in the small room behind the door, was a mirror. It was an old, ornate frame, covered in dust, but it was unmistakable. The mirror seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in this house. It reflected the room around it, the shelves and boxes, but there was something wrong about it. The reflection wasn't mine. There was a woman standing in the mirror, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror. She looked so much like Mrs. Lockwood that it took me a moment to realize she was not her. The woman's hair was long and dark, tangled, her clothes torn and stained. She was standing perfectly still, staring back at me with a look that was both pleading and desperate. My pulse raced, and I stepped back, my breath quickening. It was then that I saw it. The shadow behind the woman in the mirror, moving, shifting, like a dark figure was standing right behind her. The knocking continued, louder now, a rhythmic thud that seemed to shake the very walls. I closed the door quickly, slamming it shut, my heart hammering in my chest. The noise stopped immediately, but the air in the basement felt thick, suffocating. I turned and ran up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps deafening in the sudden silence. I don't know how I managed to get back to my room, but I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The image of the woman in the mirror stayed with me, her face still lingering in my mind. The knocking, the voice, I couldn't shake it. And now, every time I look into a mirror, I wonder if the woman is still there, watching me, waiting. The next morning, I tried to leave, but Mrs. Lockwood was already waiting for me at the door. Her expression was soft, almost sad, and as I passed her, she whispered in a voice barely audible, "I told you not to go down there." I didn't stay another night. I left the cabin, and I haven't returned since. But sometimes, when the wind is still and the night is quiet, I hear a faint knocking. It's soft at first, just a tap, but it grows louder the longer I listen, and I know it's coming from somewhere just beyond the door, just beyond the mirror. And I wonder if I'll ever truly escape what's locked away in that basement. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the landscape. It was the perfect spot, just far enough from the town to offer complete solitude, but close enough that I could easily make a trip, if needed. The cabin was small, charming in its own rustic way, with a stone chimney that sent a thin curl of smoke into the sky. The forest surrounding it seemed alive in a way I hadn't expected, the trees so dense and close that they blocked out most of the light. It was a place to unwind, to disconnect, and to finally shake off the weight of everything I'd been carrying for months. At first, it felt peaceful. The silence of the woods was almost too perfect, not a sound except for the rustle of leaves. In the occasional breeze, it was almost too quiet. But I brushed off the feeling, telling myself I was just imagining things. After all, I had wanted to be alone, to be cut off from the noise, from everything. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked dinner, and settled into the small living room with a book. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. As I sat in the armchair, staring into the flames, I felt an odd sense of peace. It was the calm I had longed for, and for a moment I thought I might finally find some rest. But then came the noises. It was faint at first, something distant, like a whispering rustle that seemed to come from outside. I ignored it, thinking, It was just the wind shifting through the branches. But as the evening wore on, the sound grew louder. The trees, I thought, the wind must have picked up, and it was pushing through the branches, making the whole forest groan. But then, as I sat listening more intently, something didn't sit right. The rustling wasn't coming from above, where the branches might move. No, it was lower, deeper, as though the ground itself was shifting, as if the trees were moving closer, their trunks bending and creaking as they inched toward the cabin. I dismissed it as my imagination, but when I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of a soft thud against the wall, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My heart raced as I got out of bed, tiptoeing quietly to the window. Outside, the darkness was thick and suffocating, the trees casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. But something was different. The trees seemed closer. I could barely make out the faintest outline of their trunks, but I was sure. They hadn't been that close when I arrived. The edge of the forest had always seemed a good distance away, but now it felt as though the trees were just inches from the cabin, their branches bending and creaking, their shadows stretching toward the house like hands. I shook my head, forcing myself to go back to bed, telling myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I awoke the next morning, the feeling of unease hadn't left. The trees still seemed too close. The air was heavier, thick with an uncomfortable stillness. I went outside to check, to convince myself that I was just imagining things. The ground was soft beneath my boots, the forest eerily quiet, and as I looked around, I realized something. The trees around the cabin had moved closer. It wasn't a trick of the light or my mind playing games. They had shifted, some of the branches now brushed against the walls of the cabin, their leaves rustling faintly in the windless air. I stood there for a long time, rooted to the spot, my thoughts racing. It didn't make sense. The trees couldn't have moved, but they had. I stepped forward, my heart thudding in my chest, and as I passed one of the larger trunks, I felt a sudden jolt in my chest, an overwhelming sense of being watched. The air felt too still, too heavy, and I had to force myself to breathe as I turned away and went back inside. The day passed slowly, the uneasy feeling never quite leaving me. I kept expecting to hear the sound of branches creaking, of something moving, but the forest remained still. The rustling had stopped, but my mind was too alert, too aware of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for something. That night, I stayed close to the fire, reading again, trying to distract myself. But the stillness outside the cabin made the silence unbearable. And then, it came again, that faint rustling, not the wind, not the trees swaying in the breeze. This was different. This was deliberate. The sound of something moving through the woods. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, walking toward the window. Outside, the trees were even closer than before. They had almost swallowed the cabin whole, the branches bending, scraping against the walls. The soft whisper of their leaves seemed to hum in the air, like an invitation, a beckoning. Something stirred just beyond my sight, moving in the darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw something. A shape, a shadow, moving between the trunks. It wasn't an animal. It was too large, too solid. I felt the weight of the forest press against me, closing in from all sides. the trees now so close that I could hear the faint groaning of their trunks bending under some unseen weight. It was as if the forest itself had come alive, had decided it wanted something, and now it was reaching out, drawing closer, inch by inch. I ran to the door, my mind racing with panic. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before whatever was happening consumed me, before the trees took me, pulled me into their twisted roots and suffocating limbs. But when I reached for the handle, the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, as if something was holding it shut, keeping me inside. I turned around, heart racing, my breath quick and shallow. The fire flickered and cast long twisted shadows across the cabin. I could hear the groaning of the trees outside, their limbs scraping against the walls, as though they were reaching for me, pressing in on every side. I stepped back from the door, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. Just outside the window. It was not a figure, but a movement, a ripple, a shift in the air, as though the very space between the trees had changed. The darkness outside seemed to deepen, the trees leaning in closer, their branches now just inches away from the glass. And in that moment, I understood. The trees weren't just moving closer, they were alive, and they were hungry. I backed away from the window, my chest tight with fear. The trees outside weren't waiting. They had already made their move. And now, they were inside. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I turned toward the door again, and this time, it opened. Slowly, as though the house itself had decided to let me out. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and bolted for the door, the weight of the forest pressing in behind me. But when I stepped outside, the trees were gone. The cabin stood alone in the clearing, the forest at a distance once more. The stillness of the night surrounded me. The air was cold and sharp, but the oppressive weight had lifted. I left the cabin that night, and I never returned. But sometimes, when I'm alone, when the wind is still and the trees are too quiet, I can still hear them. The sound of branches creaking, of leaves rustling, the sound of the forest moving, inch by inch, waiting. And I know that, even now, it's only a matter of time before the trees come closer again. I had driven for hours, the winding roads growing narrower and more isolated with each turn. The map I had on my phone didn't offer much help. Every time I thought I was nearing my destination, the signal would drop, but I wasn't in a rush. I had wanted this break for so long, a weekend alone in the woods. The thought of being surrounded by nothing but trees and silence was appealing in a way that felt almost like a second chance. When I finally found the cabin, I was relieved. It was tucked away in a small clearing, hidden behind a curtain of trees, as if the forest itself had kept it a secret. The cabin was old but sturdy, with smoke curling from the chimney, a welcoming sin. I parked my car and walked up to the door, which creaked open with an ease that hinted at years of welcoming guests. The wooden floors inside groaned as I stepped in, but everything felt cozy, familiar. The smell of wood and the faint scent of pine filled the air. I closed the door behind me, set down my things, and felt a quiet sense of peace wash over me. The place was simple, but that was exactly what I wanted. A small kitchen area, a single bedroom, and a living room with an old stone fireplace. There was a warmth to the place, a comfort that wrapped around me like a blanket. I lit the fireplace, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat down in the armchair by the fire. I was alone, finally, and it felt good. No emails, no messages, no demands. Just the crackle of the fire and the dark, silent woods outside. But as the night wore on, I began to feel the quiet pressing in. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the stillness. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the house settling, but there was something about the silence. It wasn't the comforting kind I had expected. It was thick, heavy, like something was waiting. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. When I finished my wine, I decided to call it a night. The bed was small but comfortable, and as soon as my head hit the pillow, I drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. But when I awoke, everything was different. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. My eyes opened to the dim light of early morning, the pale light filtering through the curtains. But when I looked around, I realized I was no longer in the cabin. The bed beneath me was soft but damp, the fabric scratchy. The air was cold, biting, and it smelled like wet earth. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. I was outside, not in the cabin at all. The ground beneath me was soft, covered in thick layers of damp leaves, and the trees stretched high above me, their branches swaying slightly in the wind. The woods were eerily quiet, except for the rustling of leaves in the wind. I was disoriented. My head spun as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I had been in bed just a few hours ago, and now I was lying on the forest floor, as if the world had shifted while I slept. There were no familiar walls, no cozy cabin around me, just trees, endless trees. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and looked around. The forest stretched in every direction, a sea of green and brown, with the occasional shaft of pale sunlight cutting through the canopy above. My first instinct was to call out, but something held me back. The air felt too thick to make a sound, too heavy. I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't my world. The unease settled deeper into my chest. I reached for my phone in my pocket, desperate to call someone to make sense of this. But when I pulled it out, the screen was black. No signal. I tried to turn it on again, but it wouldn't respond. I looked around, scanning the trees, trying to find anything familiar, anything that could explain how I had ended up here. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of the forest. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another. I walked for what felt like hours, the thick underbrush tangling around my boots, the trees seeming to close in on me with each passing step. I couldn't tell where I was going. I didn't know how to get back. I kept telling myself that I just needed to find the cabin, that I had only wandered a short way off. But the more I walked, the less certain I was of anything. The trees didn't look the same. The landscape had shifted in ways I couldn't explain. The air grew colder as the day wore on, and the sky above darkened, the clouds gathering in a heavy blanket. It wasn't long before the faint rustling of the leaves grew louder, almost like whispers. The wind picked up, and the trees began to groan as if they were alive, stretching and bending toward me. The sounds weren't natural. It was as if the forest itself was moving. I felt like I was being followed, like something unseen was just out of my line of sight, watching, waiting. But when I turned around, Nothing was there. Only the shadows of the trees stretching across the forest floor, the branches twisting like fingers in the wind. I tried calling out again, but my voice caught in my throat. The air felt too quiet, too still. The trees loomed higher, their dark shapes looming over me, the silence pressing down harder. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps. Light at first, like a faint echo of my own. But they were growing closer. The sound was unmistakable, crunching softly in the leaves behind me. I stopped, my heart racing, and waited, my breath caught in my chest. I turned around quickly. There was nothing, just the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, waiting for me to look away. The footsteps stopped, and then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard it. A voice, low and distant, but unmistakable. It was my name. It wasn't a shout or a call. It wasn't even loud. It was soft, almost a whisper carried on the wind, but it was unmistakably mine. Asterisk, come back. The words sent a jolt of fear through me, a deep, crawling terror that spread through my veins. My mind raced. Asterisk, who could have been calling me? I turned and ran, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder, faster, through the trees. The footsteps followed, and the voice, my name, continued to echo in the wind, growing louder, more insistent. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like hands, clawing at my clothes, at my skin, as I ran deeper into the forest, desperate to escape. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. The air was thick in my lungs, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees were silent now, still, but I could feel them, watching. I tried to stand, but the ground beneath me gave way, and I found myself falling. I reached out, grabbing for anything to stop my descent, but the world around me spun, twisting into shadows. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the cabin. The fire was crackling in the hearth, the room warm and familiar. The smell of wood and pine filled the air. I sat up, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, but everything around me was exactly as it had been when I first arrived. The same walls, the same windows, the same flickering light. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe I had just dreamed it all. Maybe it was the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the cabin, making my mind play tricks. But as I stood and walked to the window, I froze. The forest outside was dark. The trees were just a little too close, and in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, soft, steady, and unmistakable. And as I stood there, looking out, I realized something. I wasn't alone. The trees weren't just part of the forest anymore. They were closing in, and this time, they weren't going to let me leave. It had been a long week, one that seemed to drag on and on, until I finally found myself at the door of the old cabin I had rented for a much-needed weekend getaway. I wasn't particularly religious about disconnecting from the world, but this cabin, tucked far into the woods and miles away from any town, offered the perfect amount of isolation. I needed peace, time to clear my head, to breathe. The hustle and chaos had worn me thin, and the cabin was the perfect escape. I arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, its final light casting a soft glow on the thick canopy of trees around me. The wind rustled in the treetops, but other than that, the world seemed still. It was like the forest was holding its breath in anticipation of my arrival. The cabin itself looked like something out of a storybook. Wood and stone, with ivy creeping up its sides. The kind of place you'd expect to find in a fairy tale, where the world outside doesn't matter, where time stands still. Inside, the cabin was even cozier than I had imagined. The smell of old wood mixed with the earthy scent of pine from the surrounding forest. The fireplace was already stacked with logs, the firewood stacked neatly beside it. I couldn't help but smile as I set my things down and made my way to the kitchen. A hot meal and a warm fire were all I needed to wash away the stresses of the past week. But as the evening wore on and the dark enveloped the cabin, I started to feel the weight of the silence. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, its light flickering across the room. And yet I couldn't shake the unease that began to creep in, settling deep into my bones. I tried to ignore it. The air was crisp and cool, but the fire kept me warm. I had always loved the solitude, so why was I suddenly so uneasy? As I sat by the fire, the shadows of the room dancing against the walls, I tried to distract myself by reading a book. The book, however, wasn't doing much for me. The quiet, the darkness, the crackling of the fire, everything started to feel too loud, too present. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the house settling, a floorboard creaking, a beam shifting. But then, from outside, came a soft call. Ava, I froze. My name. It was unmistakable. A woman's voice, soft but clear, calling to me from outside. It didn't sound like it was coming from the trees or from the wind. It was too specific. To direct, I stood up, moving toward the window, looking out into the dark. But all I saw was the thick shadow of trees, their limbs swaying in the wind. There was no one in sight. The air was still, and the dark seemed to press against the glass, as if trying to reach inside. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind or perhaps the shadows playing tricks. After all, there was no one up there. I had rented the cabin for the weekend. I was completely alone. And yet, there it was again. Ava, the voice was clearer now, more insistent. It was coming from outside. The whisper of it shivered up my spine. I felt my pulse quicken. It wasn't an echo of my thoughts. It wasn't the wind. It was too real, too deliberate. I stepped away from the window, confused and a little shaken. I went back to the fire, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease, but the voice didn't stop. It kept calling, soft at first, then growing louder and more distinct with every passing minute. Ava, come outside. It was as though it was beckoning me, pulling me toward the door. I couldn't ignore it. My body moved toward the door without my conscious thought, but before I could reach for the handle, the voice changed. It became distorted, like a whispering sound that echoed through the cabin. It was no longer coming from outside. It was coming from the fireplace. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. The fire crackled and hissed, its warmth fading for a moment. As I stood there, frozen, the voice was unmistakable now. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't mine, nor was it anyone I knew, but somehow I knew it was meant for me. Ava, Why don't you want to come outside? We're waiting for you." I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping, and the shadows around me stretched, as though the room itself were becoming alive. The flames in the hearth flickered as the whisper grew louder, coming from somewhere deep within the fire, as though it were hidden beneath the crackling logs. The voice twisted, growing darker, colder. I took a step back, my heart hammering. I had to get out of here. But no matter where I went, the voice followed. I turned toward the door again, but the cabin was different now. It felt like the walls were closing in, like something was pulling at the edges of reality itself, warping everything around me. The fire had changed to... It burned brighter now, the flames licking higher than before, casting strange, shifting shadows that stretched across the room. "Ava," the voice whispered again, from the depths of the hearth, and it was closer this time. Too close. I turned and stumbled toward the door, my legs weak. But just as I reached for the handle, the flames erupted violently, sending a wave of heat rushing over me. I gasped, stumbling back as the fire twisted, the flames roaring like they had a life of their own. The whispers became frantic, angry even. "You can't leave," the voice hissed. "We're already inside." I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat, strangled by the overwhelming heat that filled the room. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything except the fire. The dark whispers that seemed to swirl through the smoke, wrapping around me. The fire in the hearth no longer seemed like just wood burning. It felt like something else was in it, something ancient, something aware, and it wanted me. As I reached the door, I yanked it open and stumbled out onto the porch, gasping for breath. The night air was cold against my skin, but it was a relief, a sharp contrast to the heat that had nearly suffocated me inside. I stood there, shaking, the crackling of the fire still echoing in my ears, the voice still whispering. I ran. I don't even know how long I ran, only that I couldn't stop, couldn't look back. The woods seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching like fingers, as if they were reaching for me, pulling me back toward the cabin. I don't know how I ended up back in the car, but I remember driving away, the headlights cutting through the dark forest. The voice in the cabin faded, but it never completely disappeared. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I hear it again, soft but distinct. Ava, why did you leave? I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers coming from the fire, from the hearth, and I know that whatever was calling me, it's still out there, waiting. It started as a simple walk, just a chance to clear my mind after a long week of work. I had been staying at a small cabin in the woods, tucked far away from civilization. The kind of place where the air is thick with pine and the only sound you can hear is the wind whispering through the trees. It was perfect for what I needed: isolation, quiet, a chance to forget everything. I had explored the woods before, but there was something different about this afternoon. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, painting the trees with an amber glow, and the air was cooler than usual. I decided to take a longer walk than I had in the past. There was a small trail just beyond the cabin, a well-trodden path that wound deeper into the forest. I had seen it the day before and thought it looked like a promising route, so I set off, the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the only sound accompanying me. At first, everything felt peaceful, just the sounds of the forest and the rhythm of my own footsteps. The path twisted through the trees, winding gently around the trunks, the thick canopy above blocking most of the light. I could still see enough to navigate, but there was an eerie stillness about it, the kind of silence that presses on your chest, making the air feel heavier with each step. I didn't think much of it at first. I was used to the quiet, but as I walked, something odd started to happen. Every time I looked behind me, the path had changed. It wasn't drastic at first. A tree I had passed would suddenly be further down the trail, or a rock I had noticed earlier would be gone. I stopped, stood still for a moment, and then continued, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks, or perhaps the shadows of the trees messing with my perception. But it didn't stop. The further I went, the more I noticed it. The turns in the path didn't line up the way they had before. I would look behind me, expecting to see the familiar curve of the trail I had just walked. But the forest behind me looked different. The trees closer together, the shadows darker, the ground uneven in places it hadn't been before. I even stopped and retraced my steps once, but when I turned around again, the path ahead of me had shifted. The trees were arranged differently. The trail felt unfamiliar. That's when my unease began to grow. I kept telling myself it was just the forest. It's easy to get disoriented in a place like this, where every tree looks the same, where the shadows play tricks on your eyes. But something about it felt wrong, as if the forest itself was trying to confuse me, to make me lose my bearings. I turned again, looking for a familiar marker, a fallen branch, a rock, something, but everything had shifted. The path seemed endless, twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It felt like I was walking in circles, retracing my steps without meaning to. And yet I couldn't remember taking any turns that led me back this way. I stopped and tried to steady myself, breathing deeply, trying to calm the growing panic. Just take a moment. Think, I told myself. I turned around again, hoping to spot something I recognized. A large stone that had been beside the trail was gone. Instead, I saw a patch of moss I didn't remember. The trees surrounding me, which had once seemed like old friends, now felt foreign, like they were closing in on me. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling from behind me, followed by a faint whisper. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one. No one in the woods, just the wind, rustling the leaves. But it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded like someone was moving through the forest, just beyond the trees, as if they were following me. I tried to ignore it, moving forward again, my steps hurried. But the more I walked, the more the path seemed to warp, like it had a life of its own, reshaping itself with every glance I took. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was out there, just beyond my sight, watching me, waiting. Every time I looked behind me, the trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows deeper. The panic set in faster now. I started to run, my breath quick and shallow. I needed to get out of the forest, back to the cabin. But the more I ran, the more the path seemed to twist, to change. The forest closed in around me, the trees shifting just enough to make me feel like I was going in circles. The path no longer made sense. It wasn't the way I had come. I stumbled over a root, catching myself before I fell. and when I looked up, the forest was different. The path, which had been wide and clear, was now narrow and tangled with vines. The trees, which I had passed before, now looked strange, their bark dark and twisted, their limbs reaching out like claws. My heart was pounding in my chest. I tried to stay calm, but the more I looked around, the more I realized I wasn't. Getting out, I ran faster, now not even sure which direction I was going. The whispers in the wind grew louder, but now they weren't just in the breeze. They were coming from the trees themselves. Asterisk, come closer, they whispered. Asterisk, we're waiting. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. I couldn't even hear my footsteps over the rushing of blood in my ears, over the frantic thumping of my heart. The trees weren't just watching me now. They were closing in, their branches shifting, moving like something alive. I stopped suddenly, realizing that the trees had completely surrounded me. There was no way out. The path, which had felt so wide and open when I first walked on it, had vanished, and I was left in the middle of the forest, standing on a patch of ground that felt completely alien to me. I turned around again, hoping to see the path, to see the cabin, anything familiar, but there was nothing. Just the endless, unchanging trees. The air was thick now, the smell of moss and earth overwhelming. It was darker than it should have been, the shadows deeper, and then I saw something move at the edge of my vision, something just beyond the trees. My blood ran cold. It was me. I could see myself standing in the shadows, watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure in the trees was just like me, my face, my clothes, but there was something wrong with it. The eyes were too wide, too dark, and the mouth was curled into a smile that was not mine. I wanted to run, to scream, but the figure in the shadows stepped forward, its face still locked on mine, and the forest grew silent again. Not a sound, not a breath, just the weight of the trees around me, the smell of the earth, and the shadow that looked like me, closing in from all sides. I took a step back, but the forest didn't let me leave. The path I had followed was gone, and the trees were no longer trees. They were something else, something that knew me, something that had been waiting. The whispers returned, not from the wind, but from the trees themselves, wrapping around me, pulling me deeper. And then, the world tilted. The path changed again, and I was lost. The cabin had been quiet for days, a retreat from the chaos I had left behind. It was the perfect escape, tucked away in a dense forest, far from any town, its creaky wooden frame hidden behind towering pines. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional call of birds from high up in the trees. I thought it would be the perfect place to reset, to regain some clarity. I was wrong. The first evening was peaceful, almost. I lit a fire in the hearth, cooked a simple meal, and settled into the cozy armchair by the window. The light outside was soft, the forest alive with twilight sounds, a distant hoot of an owl, the scuttling of unseen creatures. I poured myself a glass of wine, letting the warmth of the cabin wrap around me. The place had character, worn and aged, but full of charm. I could already tell that I would enjoy my time here, or at least, I thought I would. But then, just after I finished my dinner and cleaned up, it started. At first, I thought I was hearing things, the wind, maybe, or the distant hum of the forest. But no, it was unmistakable. A sound like an axe, slicing through wood with a clean, rhythmic swing. 1, 2, 3. It came from somewhere outside, deep within the trees. A long pause. Then, it came again. The same steady rhythm, as if someone were chopping wood in the clearing just beyond the cabin. I stood by the window, peering out into the darkness, but there was no one there. The forest was still, the trees standing silent in the moonlight. No sign of movement, no figure hunched over an axe. But the sound persisted. Swing, pause, swing, pause, swing. It was too precise to be an animal. It was deliberate, mechanical. Even like someone was working with purpose. I told myself it was probably another hiker, someone else out in the woods, cutting wood or working on some project of their own. Maybe I just hadn't seen them, but the more I listened, the more I felt a strange unease. I looked at the clock. It was getting late, far too late for anyone to be out there chopping wood. I decided to go outside to see if I could spot anyone, but as I stepped out onto the porch, the sound stopped. I paused, waiting for it to resume, but all I heard was the faint whisper of wind through the trees, the soft chirp of insects. The forest was as still as the cabin. I shook my head, telling myself that I was imagining things, that I had simply gotten too comfortable in the quiet. Maybe I'd dreamed it. But then, just as I was about to turn back inside, I heard it again, this time, much closer. The sound of the axe swinging, cutting into wood. It was so sharp, so distinct, that it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned toward the sound, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees crowding in, their silhouettes like watchful figures in the night. The axe continued, each swing echoing through the air, but I still couldn't see where it was coming from. I stepped off the porch, my footsteps tentative on the uneven ground. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the path was barely visible. I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in, the shadows moving around me like something alive. The sound was now deafening, too close. It was almost as if it was coming from the trees themselves, the chopping reverberating in the air, getting louder and louder. I glanced around, heart pounding in my chest. And then, in the distance, I saw something. It was a figure, a shadow moving swiftly between the trees. It was too far to make out any details, but I could see the shape of it. The way it moved, purposeful, with a strange fluidity, like a figure from a dream. The axe swung once more, and the figure seemed to stop just beyond my line of sight, disappearing into the blackness of the woods. I stood frozen, my breath shallow. The forest felt suffocating now, the sound of the axe ringing in my ears. I turned back to the cabin, but as I did, I thought I saw something flicker in the corner of my vision. The figure again, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. The axe swung once more, and this time the sound didn't fade. It was as if the figure had followed me, its presence growing louder, closer. I bolted inside, locking the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire in the hearth crackled loudly, almost too loudly. I sank into the chair, staring out the window into the blackness of the woods. The sound of the axe continued, rhythmic, insistent, as if it was determined to finish whatever task it had started. I tried to steady my breathing, to make sense of it, but nothing made sense. The forest had been so quiet when I first arrived. Now, it felt alive, teeming with something just beyond my understanding. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, made me jump, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The axe swung again, and again, and again. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because when I woke, the cabin was still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering light. The sound of the axe had stopped. The silence was suffocating, almost too perfect. But then I looked out the window. The figure was there again, standing just beyond the trees. This time, I could see him more clearly, the shape of a man hunched over, his face obscured by the darkness, his arms raised high as he swung the axe. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. His movements weren't just deliberate, they were perfect, too perfect. Each swing, each motion was so precise, so unnatural. The man didn't seem real. His figure blurred, flickered, like a shadow caught between two worlds. And when he looked up, his eyes, or what I could make out of them, didn't look human. They were hollow, voids of blackness, staring straight at me, piercing through the glass. The air grew thick again, and the ground beneath me felt unstable. I couldn't take my eyes off him, but at the same time, I felt an overwhelming urge to look away. The figure raised the axe again, and I thought I saw something move in the trees, a shadow, something that wasn't the man, something that shouldn't have been there. I blinked, and in that instant, he was gone. The axe stopped mid-swing, and the woods fell back into a dead silence. But I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it, the presence, something lurking in the trees just beyond the window, waiting, watching. I sat frozen in place, heart hammering in my chest. The axe wasn't the only thing that had been swinging. Something in the woods had been waiting, and I could feel it coming closer. I had been planning the trip for months, a quiet weekend away from the noise, the endless distractions, the overwhelming pull of daily life. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, was everything I needed, remote, simple, and peaceful, a perfect escape. It was exactly what I had imagined when I found the listing. The pictures promised a cozy, secluded space, complete with a wood-burning stove, a small loft, and surrounded by dense trees, a place where I could completely disconnect. When I arrived, the day was already beginning to fade into evening. The last remnants of sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the forest floor as I pulled up in front of the cabin. It was just as I had pictured, a small, unassuming structure, built with worn wood, its windows dim, but inviting. I could already hear the wind rustling through the trees around me, and a faint bird call in the distance. I stood at the front door for a moment, staring at the key I'd been given, the only thing I needed to enter this sanctuary. Mrs. Holloway, the owner, had been kind when we spoke on the phone. She was older, her voice soft and gentle, but there was something in her words that made me uneasy. She had said the cabin had been empty for a while, that I'd be the first guest in months. She had also been adamant about one thing, *, don't go upstairs, dear. Just stay downstairs. It's not safe up there anymore. I had brushed it off as a simple safety concern. Maybe the stairs were unstable, or perhaps the loft was being renovated. But I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, I was here to unwind, not explore a broken-down attic. So, I settled in, unpacking my things, and then made myself comfortable by the fire. The cabin's interior was cozy, just as I had hoped. The walls were lined with old bookshelves, filled with books and trinkets, and the scent of wood and dust hung in the air. I let the fire crackle and pop as I sat on the couch, wrapping myself in a thick blanket. Outside, the wind howled, making the trees groan and creak, but inside was warm and still. It was peaceful. As night settled, I curled up on the couch with a book, trying to distract myself from the growing stillness. But as the hours passed, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could point to, not an obvious noise or event, just a general unease. The house was quiet, too quiet. I kept glancing at the stairs, where the dim hallway light flickered, casting long shadows down the wooden steps. Then, from somewhere upstairs, I heard a sound, a creak, a footstep, heavy and deliberate. My heart skipped. I didn't move at first, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate footstep. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, and moved cautiously toward the bottom of the stairs. I called out, unsure why, but hoping to break the silence. "Hello, Mrs. Holloway." No answer, just the faint sound of another footstep, this time closer. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I was alone. Mrs. Holloway had said she wouldn't be back for a few days. She had left me the key, told me to make myself comfortable. But that sound, the deliberate footsteps moving upstairs, made my blood run cold. I stepped toward the staircase, my heart pounding, unsure whether I should call out again or retreat to the safety of the couch. But my curiosity, my need to understand what was happening, pushed me forward. I reached the bottom of the stairs, hesitating. The house was silent again, the footsteps gone. I peered up into the darkened hall. The stairs creaked under my weight as I slowly ascended, one step at a time, listening for any movement. The air upstairs felt colder, the silence oppressive. My eyes scanned the top of the stairs, where the hallway stretched into shadow. I reached the top, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the lingering chill in the air. I started to turn, ready to head back down when I saw it. A shadow, just at the edge of my vision. A figure standing in the doorway of the bedroom. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't seen anyone come down the stairs, and yet there it was. A silhouette, faint but unmistakable, standing motionless. For a moment, I thought it might be Mrs. Holloway, returning earlier than expected. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, perfectly still, in the dark, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I wanted to speak, to call out, but my voice failed me. My legs felt heavy as I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at the shape in the doorway. And then, it moved. Slowly, it stepped back into the room, disappearing into the darkness. A chill ran down my spine, and my body jerked into motion. I rushed down the stairs, my feet tripping over themselves in my haste. My mind raced, telling me that I had to leave, that something wasn't right about this place. I grabbed my things and ran to the door, but before I could reach the handle, I heard it again, a soft rustling, as though something was shifting upstairs, moving across the floor. I turned toward the sound, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, I heard it, a voice. Soft, almost whispering, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, as clear as day. Asterisk, you shouldn't be here. The voice came from upstairs. It was the same voice I had heard earlier, the one I had convinced myself was just the wind or my imagination. But now, it was real, and it was coming from the room at the top of the stairs. I backed away from the door, my hand trembling on the handle. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then, I saw it. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, the faintest sliver of light peeking through. It was open. It had been closed when I first came up. My mind raced as I stood there, trapped between the door and the stairs. The voice had come from behind that door, but there was no one in the house but me. I opened the door slowly, not wanting to see what was on the other side, yet unable to stop myself. The room was empty. No one was there. The bed was made, the walls bare, and the air thick with dust, untouched by time. But something was wrong. Something about the stillness felt unnatural. I stepped inside, my hand trembling as I reached out to the wall, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough wood. And then, the whisper came again, this time from behind me. You shouldn't be here. I spun around, but the room was still empty. There was no one. The door was open, and the room was just as I had left it, except for the overwhelming feeling of being watched. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my vision blurred as I backed out of the room, stumbling into the hallway. The house had fallen silent again. The footsteps, the voice, everything gone. I turned and fled, running down the stairs, out the door, and into the night. The air was cold against my skin, the forest around me quiet again, but the whisper, the voice, still echoed in my mind. It had been calling to me, warning me, and I could still hear it, soft but persistent, in the depths of the dark, from a place I could never leave behind. You shouldn't be here. The woods had always been a place of refuge for me. I'd spent countless weekends hiking through forests, losing myself in the solitude of nature. It wasn't until I found this cabin, tucked deep in the woods beyond any paved road, that I realized how far I had gone in search of quiet. The place was perfect for getting away from it all. A small, isolated cabin with only the trees for company. No neighbors, no distractions, no noise except for the wind, the occasional bird call, and the rustling leaves. The first evening was idyllic. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor as I unpacked my things. I made a fire in the hearth, set up my small kitchen, and settled down with a book. The peacefulness of the cabin, with the sounds of the crackling fire and the forest around me, felt like a balm for my overworked mind. But as the night deepened, a subtle shift occurred in the air. The sounds of the forest, normally so familiar and comforting, seemed to grow more pronounced. Like each footstep, each breath was amplified. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, but the silence felt too quiet, a quiet that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, as though something was waiting. I tried to ignore the feeling, telling myself I was just tired from the drive and the long hike to get here. As I sat by the fire, trying to relax, I heard something strange, the faint sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was the wind, maybe branches swaying, something shifting in the underbrush. but the sound didn't stop. A footstep, followed by another. The unmistakable sound of boots crunching on the forest floor, moving closer. I stood up from my chair, my heart suddenly thudding in my chest. The footsteps were too distinct, too real to be the wind. They were coming from outside the cabin, just beyond the small porch. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps had stopped, but my mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker, maybe. Someone else staying in the area. But I was alone, wasn't I? I stepped cautiously to the window, peering through the curtain. The dark shapes of the trees loomed outside, their branches swaying in the breeze. But there was no sign of anyone. Just the deep, inky shadows of the forest. I exhaled shakily, telling myself that it was probably nothing. Still, something about the quiet unnerved me, the way the night had suddenly grown so dense, so thick. With waiting, I turned away from the window and went back to the fire, trying to focus on my book. But every time I glanced up, I could feel my eyes drawn to the window again, scanning the darkness outside. The unease in my chest only grew, and every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind, seemed to echo a little too loudly. It wasn't until later that I realized I was hearing it again. The footsteps, closer this time. But just as I moved toward the door, the sound stopped. I stared at the door, my breath catching in my throat. The silence that followed felt like a weight pressing down on me. It was too still. I thought about calling out, asking if anyone was out there, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't want to hear a response, not if it meant someone or something was standing just beyond the door. I waited, but the footsteps didn't return. I spent the rest of the evening on edge, pacing between the window and the fire, my nerves on high alert, but nothing else happened. The footsteps were gone, and the silence returned. My mind was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear that faint sound echoing in my head. Eventually, I managed to fall into an uneasy sleep. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. And that's when I heard it, again. The footsteps. This time, they were unmistakable, louder, closer. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, but before I could even stand, the sound of footsteps was suddenly right outside the window. The unmistakable crunching of boots on the dry leaves, like someone was walking around the cabin, circling it. I was paralyzed, unable to move. I wanted to get up, to check, but my body felt frozen in place. The footsteps circled the cabin again and again, moving in slow, deliberate steps. Every footfall echoed in the stillness, and I couldn't help but feel that whatever was outside it knew I was awake. It was waiting, but then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they stopped. I waited in the silence, the flashlight trembling in my hands. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind in the trees, seemed to be amplified in the stillness. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A voice, not a loud voice, not a shout, but soft, and almost too close. It was as if it came from just outside the window, yet at the same time, it was almost in my ear, whispering in the quiet, "Turn around." The words were clear, as though they had been spoken to me directly, and they sent a cold shiver running down my spine. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare turn around, but I didn't need to because I could feel it. The presence behind me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, unable to move. The shadows in the room seemed to close in, and the weight of the silence became unbearable. I wanted to run, but I couldn't find the strength to do so. And then, the footsteps started again. This time, louder. They weren't coming from the outside anymore. They were coming from inside the cabin. Slowly, deliberately, one step after another, as though whatever was moving in the darkness knew exactly where I was. I turned around in a panic, and my eyes searched the room, but the cabin was empty. The air felt cold, colder than it should have been. The fire had gone out, and I was left in the oppressive darkness, with only the echo of my own breath. The footsteps grew louder, but they weren't moving toward me. They were moving away from me. The sound of boots crunching on the floor was a second too late. Every time I turned to face the sound, it moved just a little farther away, like it was leading me somewhere. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. Everything fell still. The room was completely silent. I sat there, not knowing what to do, too afraid to move, but too afraid to stay. And that's when I realized what had happened. The footsteps had been following me, always a second too late. They had echoed my movements, my steps, as if they'd been following me all along. But it wasn't just the footsteps that were wrong. It was the timing. The forest echoed my footsteps, but only after I had already moved. The sound was a step behind, always a step behind. And in that moment, I understood. The forest, the cabin, everything around me was not just watching. It was mirroring me. Every move I made, every step I took, always a second too late. And now, it was waiting for me to take the next step.